What if I told you there's a stretch of highway in Nevada where travelers simply vanish, not in crashes, not from breakdowns. They just disappear, leaving behind only their empty vehicles and a lingering sense that something ancient and hungry watches from the desert. Highway 50 through Nevada earned its nickname, the loneliest road in America, from Life magazine in 1986. They meant it as an insult. But the locals know better. Some roads are lonely for a reason. Tonight, I'm sharing 3 stories from this desolate stretch of asphalt. Stories that the Nevada Department of Transportation doesn't want you to hear. Stories that explain why, despite being a major cross-country route, so few dare to travel it after dark. These aren't urban legends. These are testimonies from survivors who barely made it off that road with their sanity intact. Story 1. The Mile Marker Incident. Sarah Chen was driving from Sacramento to Denver in October 2019. A software engineer, logical by nature, skeptical of anything supernatural. She'd chosen Route 50 specifically because her GPS showed it as the fastest route, a decision she'd regret for the rest of her life. It was 11:47 p.m. when she passed mile marker 87, just east of Fallon. She remembered the time exactly because she'd glanced at her phone, wondering if her boyfriend Mike was still awake. The desert stretched endlessly on both sides, her headlights carving a small tunnel of light through the absolute darkness. That's when she noticed the mile markers were wrong. After mile marker 87 came mile marker 86, then 85. She was driving east, but the numbers were counting backwards. Sarah pulled over, convinced she'd somehow gotten turned around. She checked her GPS. It showed her heading east on Route 50, exactly as planned. But the mile markers continued their backward countdown. 84, 83, 82. She decided to continue, assuming it was some quirk of Nevada's highway system. But as she drove, something else became apparent. The road was subtly different. The paint lines seemed fresher, brighter. The asphalt looked newer despite this being one of America's most neglected highways. Mile marker 81, 80, 79. Sarah's fuel gauge, which had shown 3/4 full when she passed mile marker 87, now read just over half. But, according to her odometer, she'd only driven 4 miles. That's when she saw the lights in her rearview mirror, not headlights. These were different, pale, flickering, like old fluorescent bulbs dying. They maintained perfect distance behind her, never getting closer, never falling back. When she accelerated, they accelerated. When she slowed, they slowed. Mile marker 78, 77, 76. Sarah tried calling Mike, but her phone showed no signal, not even no service. The signal indicator was simply gone, as if the very concept of cellular communication had been erased from her device. The lights behind her began to multiply. What started as 2 became 4, then 6, then a procession of pale, stuttering illuminations stretching back into the darkness. But when she looked ahead, the road remained empty. Whatever was following her cast no headlight beams forward. Mile marker 75, 74, 73. Her fuel gauge now read a quarter tank. The math was impossible, but the gauge didn't lie. At this rate, she'd run out of gas before reaching mile marker 1. If such a marker even existed on this backward version of Route 50. Sarah's hands began to shake. She pressed the accelerator to the floor, but the speedometer wouldn't go above 55 miles per hour, as if the car itself was being held back by some invisible force. The pale lights behind her maintained their distance effortlessly. Mile marker 72, 71, 70. That's when she heard the voices. They came through her radio even though she hadn't turned it on. Whispers at first, barely audible over the engine noise. Men's voices, women's voices, children's voices, all speaking in unison, reciting something that sounded like numbers. 70, 69, 68. They were counting down with the mile markers. Sarah frantically tried changing radio stations, but every frequency carried the same whispering chorus. She turned the radio off, but the voices continued, now seeming to come from the vents, the speakers, the very air inside her car. 67, 66. 65. Mile marker 64, 63, 62. Her fuel gauge showed empty, but the car kept running. Sarah realized with growing horror that she wasn't driving anymore. She was being pulled. The steering wheel turned freely in her hands, having no effect on the car's direction. The brake pedal went to the floor without slowing her down. 61, 60, 59. The pale lights behind her were so bright now they illuminated the interior of her car in sickly, strobing pulses. In the flashes, she could see shapes in her back seat, tall, thin figures with elongated limbs and faces that were just slightly wrong, as if someone had tried to recreate human features from a half-remembered description. Mile marker 58, 57, 56. Sarah closed her eyes and screamed. When she opened them, she was parked at a gas station in Fernley, Nevada. Her fuel tank was full. Her odometer showed she'd driven exactly 47 miles, the correct distance from where her ordeal began. Her phone showed dozens of missed calls from Mike, time-stamped over the past 6 hours, but she'd only been driving for 20 minutes. Sarah never took Route 50 again. But sometimes, on clear desert nights, she swears she can still hear those voices counting down, getting closer to zero. Story 2. The Phantom Diner. Marcus Rodriguez was a long-haul trucker with 15 years of experience driving America's highways. He'd seen it all, or so he thought, until that November night in 2021, when he encountered something on Route 50 that made him question everything he knew about reality. Marcus was hauling electronics from Reno to Kansas City, running behind schedule due to an earlier breakdown. It was 2:30 a.m. when he spotted the diner, a classic chrome and neon affair called the Midnight Stop, sitting impossibly in the middle of the Nevada desert, miles from any town. The strange thing was, Marcus had driven this route hundreds of times over the years. There had never been a diner there before. The parking lot was full of vehicles from different eras. A 1950s Cadillac sat next to a 1970s muscle car, which was parked beside a modern Honda Civic. All the license plates were from Nevada, but they bore registration stickers from decades past, some so old they'd faded beyond recognition. Marcus should have kept driving, but he was exhausted, and the thought of hot coffee and a bathroom break overrode his growing unease. He pulled his rig into the lot and walked toward the diner's glowing entrance. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, but the sound seemed to echo longer than it should have, fading into whispers. The interior was exactly what you'd expect from a classic American diner. Red vinyl booths, checkered floors, a long counter with stools, but everything had a strange quality, as if he were seeing it through thick glass. The other customers looked normal at first glance. A family with 2 young children in one booth, an elderly couple sharing pie at the counter, a businessman in a rumpled suit reading a newspaper. But as Marcus's eyes adjusted to the dim lighting, he noticed details that made his skin crawl. The family's clothing was from the 1960s, not retro fashion, but actual vintage clothing with the worn, faded quality of decades-old fabric. The children sat unnaturally still, their food untouched, their eyes fixed on some point beyond the windows. The elderly woman's hair was styled in perfect 1940s victory rolls, and her companion wore a military uniform that belonged in a museum. Neither of them moved. They sat frozen like mannequins, their coffee cups full but cold. The businessman's newspaper was dated October 15, 1987, the day the stock market crashed. But the pages weren't yellowed with age. They looked fresh off the press. A waitress approached Marcus, a young woman in a pink uniform with Betty embroidered on the pocket. Her smile was perfect, but her eyes were completely black. Not dark brown or dark blue. Black, like looking into empty sockets.
"What can I get you, honey?"
Marcus stammered an order for coffee, his trucker instinct screaming danger. Betty nodded and glided, not walked, glided toward the coffee station. Her feet never quite seemed to touch the floor. That's when Marcus noticed the smell. Underneath the expected diner aromas of grease and coffee was something else. Something organic and wrong. Like flowers left too long in water, sweet and rotting. He looked more carefully at the other patrons. The businessman's newspaper was deteriorating as he watched, the edges browning and crumbling. The elderly couple's skin had a waxy, artificial quality. The children in the booth had begun to turn their heads toward him with mechanical precision, their necks rotating far further than humanly possible. Betty returned with his coffee. The cup was old, chipped porcelain with a hairline crack that seemed to pulse like a vein. The coffee inside was black as tar and gave off no steam despite being supposedly hot.
Drink up. You've got a long road ahead of you.
Marcus pushed the cup away and stood to leave, but found his legs wouldn't move. He looked down and saw that his feet had sunk slightly into the checkered floor, as if it were made of soft clay rather than linoleum. The other customers had all turned to face him now. Their eyes were the same black voids as Betty's. The children smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too numerous. The elderly man's military uniform began to decay before Marcus's eyes, revealing rotting flesh beneath.
You can't leave yet. You haven't paid your tab.
Marcus reached for his wallet, but his hands passed through it as if it were made of smoke. Everything in his pockets, his keys, his phone, his driver's license, had become insubstantial. I don't understand. The businessman folded his crumbling newspaper and looked at Marcus with hollow eye sockets.
None of us understood at first, but you get used to it. The waiting, the watching, the serving others who make the same mistake.
Marcus realized with mounting horror that he was sinking deeper into the floor. The linoleum had reached his ankles and continued rising. The other patrons watched with expressions of sympathy and hunger. "Welcome to the midnight stop," Betty said, her form beginning to waver and stretch. "Population, everyone who stops, duration of stay, forever." Marcus closed his eyes and screamed. When he opened them, he was back in his truck, parked on the shoulder of Route 50. His CB radio was crackling with the voices of other truckers asking about his location. According to his logbook, he'd been missing for 3 days. But Marcus's ordeal wasn't over. Every time he drives Route 50 now, usually around 2:30 a.m., he sees the midnight stop in his peripheral vision. Sometimes it's close enough to the road that he can make out Betty standing in the doorway, waving at him with a smile that promises eternal servitude. He's never stopped again. But he knows that someday, when he's tired enough or desperate enough, he will. And when that happens, there will be a new waitress at the midnight stop, and Betty will finally be able to take her seat among the customers. Forever. Story 3. The children of Route 50 Inches. Dr. Jennifer Walsh was driving home to Colorado after a medical conference in Carson City. A pediatric psychiatrist with 2 decades of experience, she considered herself unflappable. She'd worked with severely disturbed children, had seen the darkest aspects of human psychology, and prided herself on her rational, scientific worldview. None of that prepared her for what she encountered on Route 50 during the early hours of March 15, 2023. It was 3:17 a.m. when she first saw the child standing by the roadside. A little girl, maybe 8 years old, wearing a white nightgown that seemed to glow in Jennifer's headlights. The child stood perfectly still about 50 yards ahead, directly in the path of the oncoming car. Jennifer slammed on the brakes, her heart hammering as she came to a stop just feet from where the girl had been standing. But when she looked up, the child was gone. Shaken but convinced she'd been hallucinating due to fatigue, Jennifer continued driving. She made a mental note to pull over at the next town and rest, but Route 50 through central Nevada offers precious few stopping points. Mile after mile of empty desert stretched ahead. That's when she saw the second child. This one was a boy, perhaps 10 years old, standing on the opposite side of the road. Like the girl, he wore white clothing, pajamas that fluttered in a breeze Jennifer couldn't feel through her closed windows. His face was turned toward her car, but his features were obscured by shadow despite her headlights shining directly on him. Jennifer slowed but didn't stop. As she passed, the boy raised his hand in what might have been a wave or a warning. In a rearview mirror, she watched him step into the road behind her and begin walking in the direction she'd come from, his small figure gradually disappearing into the darkness. The third child appeared at mile marker 112, then the fourth at mile marker 109, then the fifth, sixth, and seventh in quick succession. All children between the ages of 6 and 12, all wearing white, all standing motionless by the roadside until her car passed, then stepping into the road to follow in her wake. By mile marker 95, Jennifer counted 23 children in her rear-view mirror, walking in a perfect single-file line down the center of Route 50. Their procession stretched back into the darkness beyond the reach of her taillights. She tried to rationalize what she was seeing. Hallucinations brought on by exhaustion. Some kind of group sleepwalking incident. An elaborate prank, though who would dress children in nightclothes and send them into the Nevada desert at 3 a.m.? But Jennifer's psychiatric training had taught her to recognize the difference between hallucination and reality. These children cast shadows in her headlights. They disturbed the sand and gravel when they walked. They were real. At mile marker 87, the procession behind her had grown to over 40 children, and now they were singing. The sound came through her closed windows, through the noise of her engine and air conditioning. A simple children's song, the kind sung at summer camps and playgrounds. But the lyrics were wrong. Ring around the highway, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down, down, down. The melody was the same, but the words stretched and distorted. Down, echoing for impossibly long seconds before fading into whispers. Jennifer pressed the accelerator, trying to outrun the growing parade behind her. But no matter how fast she drove, the children kept pace. More children appeared along the roadside. Now they weren't just standing and waiting, they were stepping directly into her path, forcing her to swerve around them. Their faces, when caught in her headlights, were pale and expressionless. Their eyes reflected light like an animal's, but the reflection was wrong, not the yellow-green of normal eye shine, but a deep, dark red. Ring around the highway, pocket full of posies. The singing grew louder, more children joining the chorus with each mile. Jennifer realized with growing dread that every child she'd passed had joined the procession behind her. The line now stretched back farther than her mirrors could show. At mile marker 73, something changed. The children in front of her car no longer stepped aside when she approached. Instead, they stood their ground, forcing her to brake. When she came to a complete stop, they surrounded her vehicle. Jennifer locked her doors, though she realized how absurd the gesture was. What was she protecting herself from? Children? But these weren't normal children. Up close, she could see that their white clothing wasn't nightgowns and pajamas. They were hospital gowns. The kind worn by patients, the kind worn by her young psychiatric patients. One little girl pressed her face against Jennifer's driver's side window. Her skin was translucent, veins visible beneath like dark rivers. When she spoke, her voice seemed to come from inside Jennifer's head. "Dr. Walsh," the child said, though Jennifer had never seen her before, "you're late for rounds." More children gathered around the car, pressing their faces against the windows. They all knew her name. They spoke in unison, their voices creating a sound like wind through empty buildings. "Dr. Walsh, you promised to help us. But you couldn't. No one could." Jennifer's hands shook as she reached for her phone, but the screen showed no signal. Worse, the display kept flickering, showing different times. 3:17 a.m., 11:43 p.m., 6:22 a.m., 2:55 p.m., as if time itself had become unstable. "We've been waiting," the children continued, "waiting for someone who understands. Someone who tried to help children like us." The horrible realization dawned on Jennifer. These weren't random children. They were patients, her patients and others like them. Children who had suffered, who had been failed by the system, who had died alone and afraid in hospitals and institutions. "We're not angry," said a boy she recognized, Tommy Martinez, age 9, who had died by suicide 3 years earlier, despite her best efforts to help him. "We just want to go home, but we don't remember where home is." "Help us remember," pleaded another voice, Sarah Kim, age 7, who had died from complications during electroshock therapy at another facility. "Help us find our way." Jennifer felt tears streaming down her face. These children, these broken souls, were trapped between worlds, lost on this endless highway, searching for something they could never find. She rolled down her window slowly. Tommy's translucent hand reached through, cold as winter air, and touched her cheek. "Will you stay with us, Dr. Walsh? Will you help us this time?" Jennifer closed her eyes. When she opened them, she was parked at a rest stop near Austin, Nevada. The sun was rising, painting the desert in shades of gold and red. Her phone showed 17 missed calls from her husband and several text messages asking where she was. According to her car's clock, it was 6:45 a.m. She had no memory of the past 3 hours. But on her passenger seat was a small white flower, the kind that grows wild in children's hospital gardens. And in her rear-view mirror, just for a moment, she thought she saw a line of small figures walking away into the desert, finally heading home. Dr. Jennifer Walsh still drives Route 50 sometimes, usually during the early morning hours. She never sees the children anymore, but she carries flowers in her car, white ones, and stops at every mile marker between 73 and 112 to leave one by the roadside. She tells herself it's for closure, but deep down she knows it's because some promises transcend death, and some children are worth waiting for, no matter how long the road. Highway 50 through Nevada remains the loneliest road in America. The Nevada Department of Transportation reports no unusual incidents, no pattern of disappearances, no supernatural occurrences. But the locals know better. They know that some roads attract more than just travelers. They become repositories for lost souls, gathering places for the forgotten and the frightened. If you ever find yourself driving Route 50 after dark, remember these stories. Pay attention to the mile markers. Don't stop at diners that shouldn't exist. And if you see children by the roadside, don't assume they're lost. They might be exactly where they need to be, waiting for someone brave enough to help them find their way home. Drive safely. Some roads never forget their passengers.